What begins as an ordinary repair visit transforms into a chilling mystery when Erin Jacobs enters Mrs. Langley's home, only to discover her frail body trembling and clothed in blood-stained bandages. Yet, what truly disturbs him is not merely her appearance but rather what she is concealing. Erin Jacobs, an experienced repairman, had traversed numerous homes and encountered all sorts of people, but nothing in his vast experience had prepared him for what awaited beyond that door. He knocked, anticipating the familiar shuffle of feet he had grown accustomed to when visiting elderly clients, but was met by silence. With a frown, he knocked again, this time more forcefully, his knuckles rapping against the worn wood. Seconds elongated into what felt like an eternity before the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Langley, a woman he had met only once but remembered vividly. However, the figure before him bore no resemblance to the sprightly woman he recalled. She stood hunched over, her fragile body shaking as if even the act of standing was a struggle. Her once bright eyes now appeared dull, and her neatly pinned silver hair hung in greasy strands around her sunken face. Yet, it wasn't only her disheveled appearance that sent a shiver down Erin's spine. It was the thick, yellowing bandages tightly wrapped around her arms, dark red stains seeping through the fabric. His stomach tightened. His first instinct was to offer assistance. But her weak smile halted him. She didn't want that. "Sorry for the wait, young man. The heat is on the fritz again, isn't it?" Her voice wavered as she struggled to articulate the words. Erin hesitated, his gaze fixated on the bandages. "Mrs. Langley, are you sure you're okay?" "Those bandages." She waved him off with a trembling hand, her movements sharp yet exhausting. "Nothing to worry about, just a little fall in the garden. I'm fine, really." The effort to reassure him seemed to sap what little strength she possessed, and Erin found himself unconvinced. Something was not right, very wrong. Yet, he wasn't inclined to push her. With a slow nod, he stepped inside, but the moment he crossed the threshold, an unsettling feeling gnawed at his gut. The air within was thick, heavy, and wrong. A simple repair job evolves into a chilling puzzle as Erin Jacobs steps into Mrs. Langley's house. The air is saturated with decay, her frail body wrapped in bandages, and a noise creaks from upstairs, filling the silence. But the true horror is what she's attempting to hide. The air carried a scent of dampness and decay that wrapped around Erin like an unwelcome presence. The house was dim, with curtains drawn tightly to block out the sunlight that might have sliced through the oppressive gloom. "Just in here," Mrs. Langley murmured, gesturing towards the narrow hallway leading to the heater. She moved ahead of him, her steps slow and unsteady, one trembling hand gripping the wall for support. Erin followed, his gaze sweeping across the room, absorbing the unsettling state of the house. Dust coated the worn furniture, untouched and forgotten. A pile of unopened letters lay abandoned on a small side table near the entrance, their edges yellowed with age. Every detail, the frail figure, those bandages, the neglected home, tightened the knot of unease in Erin's stomach. He knelt by the heater, focusing on the repairs, but the eerie silence that enveloped him pressed in. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the floorboards and Mrs. Langley's labored breathing behind him. Yet an inexplicable chill crept up his spine, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Glancing over his shoulder, he found her slumped in an old armchair, hands resting in her lap, wrapped in even more bandages. Her breath was heavy, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. "Are you sure you're all right, Mrs. Langley?" Erin asked gently. "I can call someone for you." Her eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest moment, he could have sworn he saw something flicker in her expression. Fear. But it vanished just as quickly. "No need for that. Dear, really, I'm fine, she insisted, yet her voice trembled, lacking conviction. She shifted in her chair, wincing at the movement as if even speaking drained her strength. Aaron worked quickly, but his mind wasn't on the heater. It was focused on Mrs. Langley and the unshakable discomfort of the house. He gathered his tools, preparing to leave when something compelled him to pause. A sound, faint and almost imperceptible, a slow rhythmic creaking from upstairs. He stood still, listening intently. Mrs. Langley noticed. Her body tensed, her hands clenching in her lap. Then she sat up a little straighter, forcing a smile that felt too quick, too forced. "Thank you, Aaron," she said hurriedly. "I appreciate you fixing the heater. It gets so cold in here at night." Aaron didn't move. "Is everything okay upstairs?" he asked cautiously, his voice careful, ears straining for the sound. "Everything's fine," she snapped, the sharpness of her voice slicing through the tension. But even as she spoke, she flinched, gripping her side as if the outburst had physically pained her. Immediately, her expression softened, and she shook her head, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm sorry, dear. It's just been a hard few weeks. I haven't been myself." Aaron nodded slowly, yet the weight of the moment pressed down heavier upon him. He could sense her desperation, her urgency to push him away before he witnessed too much. But what was it that she didn't want him to see? The bandages, the eerie noises from above, the sealed-off upstairs. Everything about this house whispered of something worse than she was willing to confess. He hesitated, one foot poised between leaving and remaining. Aaron lingered in the doorway, caught in a struggle between duty and instinct. His job was complete. He could walk away and pretend that everything was fine. But the uneasy feeling tugged at him, a whisper in his mind urging him to go further. Mrs. Langley clearly didn't wish for him to dig any deeper, but how could he just leave? Before he could resolve his thoughts, her voice softened, carrying a quiet plea. "Please, Aaron. I appreciate your concern, but I'll be all right. I just need some rest." Her dull eyes held a sadness that words couldn't conceal, a quiet, unspoken pain that settled deep in Aaron's chest. He swallowed hard, forcing a reassuring smile despite every instinct urging him to stay. "All right, Mrs. Langley, but if you need anything at all, you call me, okay?" She nodded weakly, her gaze dropping to the floor as if the conversation had drained her remaining energy. Aaron stepped out into the afternoon air, the door clicking softly behind him. He inhaled deeply, but the strange musty scent of the house clung to him, refusing to release its hold. While standing on the porch, his eyes wandered to the second-floor window, where curtains were drawn tightly, concealing whatever lurked within. That creaking sound, was it still occurring? Shaking off the apprehension, he made his way to his van, yet even as he drove away, his mind lingered on that house. The image of Mrs. Langley's trembling hands, the bandages, the suffocating silence, everything remained, a heavy weight pressing against his thoughts. Something was wrong, and deep down, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he encountered that house. Mrs. Langley sat motionless in her armchair, breathing shallowly, her hands resting weakly in her lap, swathed in even more bandages. Aaron hesitated, his concern escalating with every second. "Are you sure you're all right, Mrs. Langley? I could call someone," he offered gently, careful not to startle her. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a fleeting moment, fear flashed within them. But it faded just as quickly. "No need for that, really. I'm just fine," she insisted, although her voice wavered, exposing her true state. As she shifted in her chair, she winced, the movement clearly painful. Aaron forced himself to concentrate on the heater, yet his thoughts were not on the repairs. They were fixated on Mrs. Langley and the oppressive discomfort that permeated the air. Something was very wrong. He packed up his tools, absently wiping his hands while his thoughts raced. Then he heard it, a sound, faint, nearly engulfed by the heavy silence, a slow rhythmic creaking coming from upstairs. Aaron froze. His pulse quickened. He glanced at Mrs. Langley, and her reaction revealed everything. Her body stiffened, her shoulders tensing as if bracing for something. Then she forced a smile, but it felt too quick and too rehearsed. "Thank you, Aaron," she said, her voice oddly rushed. "I appreciate you fixing the heater. It gets so cold in here at night." Aaron remained still, his ears straining for the sound once more. "Is everything okay upstairs? I keep hearing, 'Everything's fine,'" she snapped, her tone sharp and uncharacteristically forceful, causing the air in the room to constrict. She immediately winced, her hand flying to her side as though the outburst had physically distressed her. Then, her expression softened, and her voice fell to a whisper. "I'm sorry, dear," she murmured, shaking her head. "It's just been a hard few weeks. I haven't been myself." Aaron's grip around his toolbox tightened. He felt her desperation now, her quiet plea for him to give it up, to walk away before he saw too much. But what was it she didn't wish for him to see? The bandages, the noises from upstairs, the way she kept trying to usher him out. It all pointed to something far more dreadful than she was admitting. He hesitated, caught halfway in the doorway, torn between departing and digging deeper. Every instinct urged him not to walk away. Then her voice softened once again, almost pleading. "Please, Aaron. I appreciate your concern, but I'll be okay. I just need some rest." Her dull, weary eyes mirrored a sadness he couldn't quite pinpoint, a sort of pain that clung to her like a shadow. Aaron swallowed hard, forcing himself to nod. He couldn't abandon her, not for even a second. "All right, Mrs. Langley, but if you need anything at all, you call me, okay?" She nodded weakly, her gaze dropping as though the conversation had exhausted the last bit of her strength. Aaron stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind him. The crisp afternoon air hit him, but he still felt the weight of that house bearing down on him. The scent of damp decay still lingered in his senses. His eyes drifted up to the upstairs window, where the curtains were drawn tightly, silence stretching too thick. Was that creaking sound still occurring? A shiver crawled down his spine as he made his way to his van. But even as he drove away, the image of Mrs. Langley's frail, bandaged hands and the eerie silence of that house persisted. Something wasn't right, and deep down, he understood that this was far from over.